Katerina was saying, I've got around 40 minutes. As people might have noticed yesterday, I can sometimes ramble a little bit when I go on about a particular topic, when I get on a bugbear about something, so I'll try to avoid that today and look over to Katerina to give me a sort of 10-minute or a 5-minute warning when I'm getting close to the end of the talk, because I think it's really important that we have some time for a nice discussion about some of the themes that I hope to touch on today. So what is agnotology's media problem? Well, briefly, I mean, I know we don't need to spend much time on it, but you know what the concept of agnotology is. It was developed in path-breaking work by scholars like the historian Robert Proctor, who used this concept to describe the cultural production and reproduction of ignorance. And he talked about the ways that large industries, including the tobacco industry, as well as industries like the big pharma, can sometimes compound and exploit uncertainty and unknowns surrounding the adverse effects of various products or actions that can have nefarious and sometimes pernicious effects on things like the environment or on people's health. So this has led people like, I'm going to focus in particular on one media article that got a lot of circulation last year that was developed by an economist named Tim Harford, who wrote an article in the Financial Times called The Problem with Facts. And he drew explicitly on Proctor's notion of agnotology to describe what he saw as the rise of a sort of post-truth era in the post-2016 period, where essentially alternative facts were seen to be triumphing over the idea of a more rigorous adherence to scientific norms of truth. And he pointed to a very problematic claim that was perpetuated by people who were on the leave side of the England vote to leave the EU or to stay within it. And it was a claim that suggested that the UK sends £350 million a week to the EU, and if the UK leaves the EU, the money would then go to the NHS. And this was a lie, in essence, because it was a gross figure that was inflated by those on the Leave campaign side. It was a clear case of misinformation. And Hartford points out that, in his words, it is hard to think of a previous example in modern Western politics of a campaign leading with the transparent untruth, maintaining it when refuted by independent experts, and going on to triumph anyway. And this was a good point of his. But on the other side of the problem, he also suggested a certain exceptionality to this use of deception by powerful groups that is in some ways itself something of a myth, okay? So I'm going to suggest that in ways, the seeming exceptionality of the so-called post-truth era is in itself a bit of a myth itself, because it suggests that we can be nostalgic for a period prior to 2016 where there was more of a fidelity to truth amongst powerful organizations. And I think that's a misperception that people like Mr. Harford are unwittingly at times perpetuating. He also perpetuates a simplistic binary opposition of so-called lay members of the public and expert authorities who he suggests needs to be better adhered to so that the public, in essence, has a better understanding of the actual truth. And he juxtaposes essentially people like the Leave campaigners against groups like the World Bank, who he suggests have more of an expert voice and an expert legitimacy to perpetuate a more truthful understanding of global economic governance. So his solution to the problem of misinformation that was perpetuated by powerful figures, in some ways, I argue, problematically flipped the problem onto the public. It suggests that the public was too apathetic or incurious to investigate the facts properly, and what's needed are more charismatic figures like, for example, the late Swedish statistician Hans Rosling, who he suggests through charismatic presentations can better educate the public about so-called official data from sources like the World Bank. So he suggests we must engage so-called incurious voters, those who prefer football, Game of Thrones, or baking cake, to complex discussions of banking reform. We must engage this seemingly incurious public in the expert knowledge based at places like the World Bank. This is problematic for three main ways. It's problematic because it overestimates the exceptionality of lies and deception amongst members of the public in the seemingly so-called post-truth era of the post-2016 period onwards. It overestimates the seeming ideological or non-agnotological purity of places like the World Bank, and I'll provide an example in a moment that points to the fact that the World Bank should not necessarily be seen as exempt from the problem of expert ignorance, both witting ignorance and unintentional ignorance, as Mr. Harford presumes. And again, it problematically perpetuates this simplistic dichotomy between expert voices and lay voices in a way that holds the lay public, the so-called lay public, responsible for misinformation that's originating often from powerful groups, which was a central idea of agnotology, which is missed through Mr. Harford's understanding of what agnotology is trying to convey through its studies of misinformation at places like big tobacco or big pharma. So I'm sorry for the slightly gendered emphasis on homo ignorance. I think it's a little bit too male-focused, but I think it is important to dispute the idea that the actual homo ignorance is the so-called lay voter, the lay person who has largely been blamed for the election of figures like Mr. Trump in America or the decision to leave the EU recently. We need to sort of flip the binary relationship and the top-down relationship that suggests that the homo ignorance is the layperson, and start to see the homo ignorance as people who are perpetuating misinformation rather than people who are being misled by problematic deception by powerful groups. So, are we living in a uniquely post-truth time? No. In reality, powerful groups have often relied on fear-mongering, deception, and untruth in order to realize different institutional or political objectives. So this is a quote from the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who suggested back in 1931, this is surrounding the 1931 national election, general elections are always dismal affairs, but I do not think I remember any election in which more outrageous lies were told by leading statesmen. So essentially, Maynard Keynes was pointing to what he saw as a uniquely post-truth 1931 election, which points to the fact that we have to, in some ways, look at the problem of misinformation stemming from power groups in a much more historical way, in order to contest the idea that if we simply go back to the pre-2016 era, we will, in some ways, be able to resuscitate more of a fidelity to truth, more of an honest politics. And that sort of assumption that there's a huge schism or chasm between the post-2016 era and the pre-2016 era, in some ways lets powerful groups off the hook for earlier forms of propaganda that have had quite pernicious effects. So, for example, the 2003 invasion of Iraq was also surrounded by a lot of propaganda and a lot of seeming misinformation stemming from powerful groups. And in some ways, the idea that we're living in a uniquely post-truth era misrepresents that earlier form of propaganda. To give just one example, Tony Blair, who was then Prime Minister of the UK at the time, always contested the idea that the possibility to exploit Iraq's oil reserves were in any way a factor leading to the Iraq War. I'm not suggesting that they were the main factor, but they could have been one factor. And we know through the release of confidential memos that, for example, prior to the invasion, you had Blair's then Labour Trade Minister suggesting in secret meetings, yes, it would be difficult to justify British companies losing out in Iraq, and promising during meetings with stakeholders like BP and Shell that she would lobby on their behalf to ensure that they could essentially get their foot in the door once the invasion had taken place, once the war had been launched and was over. And a year later, Blair contested the idea that oil could have been a motive for the war as absurd. So you have this imbalance between what we know from the release of confidential memos that were reported in reputable news outlets like The Independent in the UK, which is one of the UK's leading newspapers, We know later, 10 years later, that a certain degree of misinformation, of agnotological perpetuation of untruths, did underlie that invasion. But at the same time, there's a discounting of that earlier reliance on alternative facts, earlier reliance on untruth, now through our effort to suggest that there's something exceptional about the post-2016 era. Again, too, I want to come back to Mr. Harford's suggestion that it's possible to juxtapose the ignorance of the public against the expertise of places like the World Bank, and to, in some ways, better educate the public through a reliance on the so-called official data from the World Bank. Again, that emphasis does not necessarily engage with what we know to be the fact that the World Bank is itself not divorced from political pressures that lead it to, in some ways, perpetuate the interests of often Western stakeholders. It is a Washington, D.C.-based organization. It is heavily linked to the United States through funding ties. Most of its funding does come from the United States, or a higher proportion of funding comes from the United States. Every leader of the World Bank has always been a U.S. citizen and has typically been a former executive at a Wall Street bank or a diplomat. And we know that the World Bank has been shown to essentially at times let ideological goals influence its decision-making. So the assumption that the World Bank is more of a sort of ideologically pure organization that the public can rely on for unbiased information is a problematic assertion on Mr. Harford's point, but I don't think Mr. Harford is intentionally trying to let the World Bank off the hook. I think he simply might not be aware of some of the problems surrounding the World Bank's tendency to use methodologies that sometimes reflect more conservative party leaders in a better light than non-conservative party leaders. So we know, for example, that in 2018, the World Bank's chief economist, Paul Romer, admitted that sometimes his staff can, as he put it, place their thumb on the scales when carrying out methodologies that try to assess the business culture, the investment-friendly culture of a developing or a middle-income or a wealthy nation. So, for example, he admitted that when the Socialist Party leader Michelle Bachelet, who was the former president of Chile, was in power, the bank favored a methodology that led to worsening investment scores. But when conservative President Pinera took power, the scores then improved. So it was a juggling of the methodology in a way that made Chile's investment environment look more favorable towards external investment, but this in a way undermines Bachelet's efforts to run her country as she wishes. It was an undermining of the autonomy of Chile. And he apologized, Romer, for this methodological juggling of the facts. But in essence, it's a long-standing problem, and it's one that Mr. Harford doesn't recognize in his Financial Times article, where he holds the World Bank up as an exception to the problem of agnotology and as a body that should be looked to for so-called impartial evidence when it comes to global economic governance. So this leads to really a problem with how elite and so-called lay knowledge has been understood in the post-2016 era. We have on one side a lot of denigration of lay publics for decisions that many of us do dislike. I dislike the fact that the UK voted to leave the EU. I dislike the fact that Mr. Trump has been elected president in the United States. But I don't think his election or the decision to leave the EU can be placed on public ignorance in the manner that Mr. Harford suggests. And I don't think the solution to this public ignorance is to try to exhort the public to be more trusting in expert advice, in expert decision-making, because in some ways this exonerates expert voices who have either wittingly or unwittingly perpetuated an idea of global economic governance that suggests that certain measures like austerity, fiscal policies, or trying to reflect Chile in an investment light that suggests once a conservative president is in power that it's more open to financial investment, I think, in essence, we are perpetuating a problematic dichotomy between lay voters and so-called elites. And why this is quite problematic, in essence, is because of a new concept or idea that is starting to perpetuate the idea that in order to contest the problem of lay ignorance, we should be implementing and instantiating systems of political rule that deliberately prevent voters from voting unless they pass certain knowledge-based tests that can show that they have sufficient knowledge and acumen to have a say in voting decisions. So epistocracy is a concept that has emerged over the past few years, and it was explored in the most depth by a proponent of the idea named Jason Brennan. And he is calling for what he describes as a system of rule by knowers, which he explicitly holds up as an alternative to democratic systems which he suggests malfunction because the ignorance of so-called incompetent voters leads to poor decision-making. And I think that ignorance studies scholars have many epistemological reasons for intervening in this debate in ways that could challenge many underlying assumptions that Mr. Brennan, Professor Brennan, is perpetuating in a largely uncontested way currently. So essentially, epistocracy, it is exactly what it suggests. The emphasis is on epistemology, and it suggests, in his view, that we have no reason for presuming that democratic forms of governments are either inherently more just than other forms of political authority, or that they have better instrumental value, that they lead necessarily to better political outcomes. So I hope I'm being clear about my own normative position on epistocracy. I think it's a dangerous idea, I think it's a spurious idea, and I think it could lead to an effort to disenfranchise voters in ways that replicate some of the disenfranchisement efforts of the 30s, 40s, as well as really recently there's been new efforts to try to limit the voting capacity of different denigrated groups in places like the United States through the fact that, for example, in many places in the US, former felons are barred from life for voting, even when they finish serving a sentence. So there have always been ongoing efforts in Western democracies to marginalize different voters for often partisan reasons, because certain voters might support parties that are less friendly to the interests of, say, the working classes or the seemingly so-called less educated. So why I think Brennan's argument is so problematic in many ways is because of the way it's being legitimated by very authoritative groups like Princeton University Press, who published his book, Against Democracy. And I'm in no ways in favor of censorship or against free speech. I think any organization has the right to suggest different seemingly radical ideas. But in a way, it is surprising that places like the New York Times, places like the Princeton University Press, are quick to criticize far-right populism, justly so, I think, and to criticize people like Stephen Bannon, who is also, in some ways, arguing for a revival of authoritarian forms of rule. But in the same time, these same groups, centrist media, are in other ways giving people like Brennan a free pass to perpetuate equally pernicious attacks on the legitimacy of democratic forms of rule. Okay? So some of Brennan's ideas include the idea that instead of allowing one vote per adult, you have a proposal that he calls the idea of a simulated oracle, which he describes as a type of mechanism that could calculate the demographic information of an individual voter, and based on what a statistician or a demographer knows about the best economic solutions for that particular stakeholder group, the oracle would then force the voter to cast her or his vote based on the oracle's enlightened, calculation of the best interest of the voter rather than based on her or his less informed idea about what is right for her own best interests. At times, Brennan's book uses explicitly denigrating language, in my view, denigrating because it's trying to compound racial divisions in a way that might be described as race baiting in the past. So in his book, he suggests that there's no reason not to think that excluding the bottom 80% of white voters from voting would not necessarily lead to better outcomes for black individuals. And I think there's actually a lot of good reasons politically to think that excluding the bottom 80% of white voters from voting would lead to worse outcomes for both marginalized black citizens and white citizens. But Brennan essentially veils his own politics behind an ideology of neutrality, which suggests that the simulated oracle in an unproblematic way could lead to better knowledge of what both poor and black citizens and black and white citizens do need. So I think it's clear, I hope, to some of you, and I should mention too, this for me is a new discussion of epistocracy. This is the first time where I've been describing some of my concerns with it. I describe it further in a book that's forthcoming next year. But because of the newness of the concept itself, because of the speed at which this idea is starting to gain a certain political legitimacy in the United States, I think many of us have not necessarily had time to develop fully articulated criticisms of the idea, but I think it's clear that there are deeply problematic power-based reasons to object to the notion of epistocracy, but also important epistemological criticisms of the idea. And the main criticism, epistemologically, is the idea that so-called experts are necessarily going to be able to make decisions in a way that doesn't reflect their own biases, as well as secure the ability to veil those biases behind a veneer of impartiality. Okay? So, to date, most of the criticism of epistocracy, of which there hasn't been a lot because it is a fairly new concept, but it is a concept that's been written about in quite leading centrist media like Vox Media or The New Yorker, often in fairly favorable terms, okay? So there has been this sort of acceptance of the idea in ways that I think is deeply problematic. And for example, a political theorist I admire a lot does point out some of the political problems with the concept, but he is too quick, I think, to neglect some of the epistemological implications of it, as well as too quick to fail to understand underlying epistemological limitations within it. So he suggests that the problem with epistocracy is the second part of the word, the emphasis on power, rather than the first, the emphasis on knowledge. Let me explain what he means by power. He means that this system of governments, if implemented, would have no accountability checks that limit the ability of a powerful group from using its own authority to implement self-serving political policies that increase, for example, already quite severe wealth concentration in the United States, that lower regulations on corporate externalities, okay? So there's no accountability measures that prevent the possibility of a powerful group from exploiting its own power base in order to realize different personal incentives. But again, his suggestion that epistocracy is flawed simply because of the power implications, in my view, does not address the epistemological errors within the presumption that rule by so-called experts will lead to better forms of rule. So I've got around 15 more minutes, I hope, to come back to where I think an ignorant studies framework can contest the assumption that so-called expert rule leads to better rule. In essence, I think rather than epistocracy leading to rule by so-called knowers, I think it will lead to rule by both witting and unwitting agnotologists, okay? People who can either deliberately compound and mobilize ignorance for personal gain, as well as people who unintentionally face no external mechanisms that alert them to their own blindnesses or biases, okay? There's no ability to uproot path dependencies or forms of groupthink that can become more entrenched because you have essentially a tiered system of knowing where experts are able to maintain that their decision-making is inherently more sound than it might be because they face no external exogenous checks on the legitimacy of that knowledge. So it leads to the ability of people like Harford, who is well-meaning when he suggests the World Bank should be relied on, but there's less of a possibility for people to point out that the World Bank's own methodology might be biased in ways because you limit the groups of people who are able to bring in a new form of perspectival knowledge, who can point out that the legitimacy of an organization depends on who is counting that organization's actions. So to Panera, the World Bank's methodology is sound. To the prior president, it isn't, and it takes an external voice to point that out to a group of insiders. So as ignorant studies scholars have pointed out many times, drawing on earlier work by people like standpoint epistemologists, standpoint feminism, as well as earlier Enlightenment recognition of the fact that the question of whose knowledge counts depends on which type of groups are seen as legitimate social actors in a way. It depends on prior assumptions of whether human beings are fundamentally equal or not. And the Enlightenment challenge essentially to ideas of inherited privilege was to point out that essentially power shouldn't rest on the inheritance of privilege, but rather power should be dispersed throughout a citizenry. So in order to contest some of the ideas of epistocracy, we don't have to start from a sort of blank slate position. There's a really important, well-recognized body of political science which has pointed out some of the problems with authoritarian rule that tries to limit decision-making to an elite group of actors. Epistocracy is not a completely new phenomenon. It points for legitimacy back to thinkers like Plato, who suggested that rule by an elite group can sometimes be more effective than rule by a disgrouped group of electors. But Karl Popper, an important philosopher of science who in the 1940s and 50s developed a really important refutation of the idea and the legitimacy of authoritarian forms of politics, didn't simply root his criticism of authoritarian politics in the problem of absolute power or the propensity to be able to engage in brutally violent acts without accountability. He also developed a really important epistemological criticism of the idea that any group of knowers that faces no exogenous checks on their own decision-making leads to a degeneration of knowledge in his view, rather than the possibility of more enlightenment. Okay? So it's that problem of groupthink that Popper pointed to. The fact that, in his view, elite rule can lead to the development of caste states, where you have a sort of tiered hierarchy of people whose right to fundamental dignity, or whose right to be seen as fully human, was always predicated on this assumption of how much they can be shown to know. Well, we know some of the problems with this presumption. It can lead to people developing biased tests of voter knowledge, okay? We know the history of literacy tests that were used explicitly to exclude marginalized or denigrated minority groups, okay? And we also know that this problem of elite rule never overcomes the problem of groupthink, where a group of actors essentially propagate each other's assumptions of what is truth, okay? So he also pointed out that you can have a naive belief that society is progressing to an inevitably better future by selecting evidence that tends to legitimate one's ideology rather than to falsify it. So his criticisms of sort of pseudoscience were also linked to his insistence that forms of falsification were important for developing a more robust knowledge base, okay? A group of elite knowers faces no exogenous checks on their own knowledge base, so there's no incentive for them to falsify their own belief systems, okay? This is one of the most important criticisms of the idea that epistocracy will lead to so-called rule by knowers. I want to spend about 7 more minutes just finishing up with what I think, and what I hope the ignorance studies framework can do to help expand and to enlarge Popper's earlier criticism of so-called, what he called know-it-all authoritarianism, okay? The idea of epistemocracy is a type of authoritarianism that's equally predicated on the idea that certain groups know better than others. So, as I point out in a forthcoming book, essentially, rule by knowers likely, and we've got good historical evidence from the past about when we look at authoritarian states that have failed, okay, it's partly because it leads to an inability to plan effectively for the future because there's a reluctance to solicit external advice or know-how from others who are seen by system of the rule itself as being de facto, on a de facto basis, illegitimate knowers, okay? The system itself portends that they have less of a claim to be able to advise rulers because they failed these earlier voter knowledge tests, which then disqualifies them from being eligible members of the citizenry who can give the governors an idea of how to govern better. So rule by knowers leads to rule by both unwitting and unwitting agnotologists. And I suggest that for reasons that link to Popper's own criticism of so-called caste states, democracy is instrumentally superior, as well as being inherently just, because it opens up the possibility of allowing people who are sometimes seen as unknowers to overcome an earlier paradigm by pointing out that seeming anomalies, in a sort of Kuhnian sense, might not be anomalies, but are actually imperfections within the system itself. So only democracy, in an epistemic sense, allows for unknowers to be able to point out flaws within an existent paradigm that calls on a group of governors to have to, in essence, listen to their objections. I lied when I said it would be 7 more minutes, about 8 more minutes ago, because I now have 3 more. I want to finish up, and it'll take me around 5 more minutes, okay? So in a book that I hope is coming out next year, it keeps getting delayed, and my publishers say, where's the book, where's the book? And I say, well, hey, these new concepts like epistocracy are being invented by fairly problematic voices in the United States, so I've added new chapters to try to address the problem to epistocracy, so this book just keeps getting more and more unwieldy, but I do hope it's out next year. And I introduced this idea, which interestingly I coined or developed before I learned of this notion of a simulated oracle. I was trying to think about something that people like me and people like Matthias Gross have talked about a lot, and I point to Gross's use of this point in a minute, the idea that certain groups of people have an ability and a power to both define as well as to forge a consensus about where the boundaries of knowledge and ignorance lie. Okay, so this is how I'm defining oracular power. The power to define the boundary between knowledge and ignorance. And this boundary constantly shifts, okay? Contestations arise. New forms of ideas and new epistemologies break through earlier epistemes in a way that leads to new enlightenment. But the power to determine where the boundaries of knowledge and ignorance lie tends to often rest with people who have a prior degree of expertise or status, okay? And I suggest that that reality can become exploited in a system of epistocracy. So in the books, one of the ways where I try to explain this so-called oracular power is by pointing out that over the 20th century, new systems of economics housed within the sort of framework of neoclassical economics in many ways displaced an earlier emphasis on distributive justice that people like Adam Smith and Thomas Paine actually called for. And I give an example in a minute. And this is why I'm quite interested actually in Kelly Owen's talk yesterday, which I'll come back to in a minute, because the idea of neoclassical economics is predicated in some ways on the idea of income aligning naturally to people who produce the most value for society. But if you have a group of fund managers who essentially can never outperform a more passive index, then that undermines the idea that they do have this exceptional insight that should be rewarded through exceptional financial gains. So I try in the book to point out a few examples of times when allowing for the possibility of unknowers to contest the seeming seeming truths of knowers is really important for leading to new enlightenment. And I point in particular to the ideas of John Stuart Mill. And he's an interesting figure in many ways because he was in favor of a limited franchise, okay? He was in favor of the idea that education qualifications should be used to legitimate a person's right to vote. So he has been harnessed by today's epistocrats as someone who would essentially be on their side. But what they neglect to point out is that Mill's idea of education qualifications being used as a criterion for voting were advanced at a time when only property rights were used or seen as legitimate as the right to hold the right to vote. So his contestation to property rights being a sole criteria was itself the type of unknowing radicalism that I suggest would be perverted in a system of epistocracy if invented or implemented today. So I think that Mill, although some of his ideas could be seen to support epistocracy, actually the value of his theories undermines the plausibility of epistocracy being a more philosophically robust or superior form of knowing. In particular, he would point out that Bentham's rigid attachment to a sort of type of laissez-faire economics was itself a form of rigid dogmatism that Mill pointed out was problematic. And a key example would be the fact that Adam Smith, who is upheld as a sort of leading figure of laissez-faire economics today, actually called for a lot more government regulation than he is recognized today as adhering to and being a proponent of. So, for example, Smith called for government limits on lending policies and on the level of interest rates that could be attached to loans, okay? This is an important policy mechanism which in many ways aligns with leftist critiques today of what are called so-called predatory lending policies, okay? Predatory inclusion that leads to greater indebtedness. Bentham, who is always a bit more sort of pedantic than Smith, said, well, actually, Smith, this is a violation of your suggestion that self-interest can lead to positive overall public gains. And so Bentham's criticism of restraints on usury policies carried the day, really, for the next 180, 200 years. And my point is that you will have more of a likelihood of sort of positions like Bentham's leading to an entrenchment of a prior policy idea when you have fewer allowances for the idea of an external group of unknowers being able to contest the dogma of an insider group. So just to come back to this again, I want to come back to the World Bank example and talk about the ways that oracular power, which again I coined before realizing that people like Brennan are calling explicitly and literally almost for a sort of a simulated oracle. I use the term in a metaphorical way to try to talk about different groups who are upheld as having a sort of oracular legitimacy in secular societies. So the reason I use oracular power is not to point back to a sort of notion of the value or the sort of perception in antiquity that certain so-called oracles were sort of voices of the gods. Okay, I don't mean to imply any sort of aspect of divinity surrounding my usage of oracular power. How I'm using the concept is simply to suggest that certain groups are upheld as having a sort of rarefied or an exclusive form of authority in secular societies, and we need, as critics of agnotology and ignorant studies scholars, to be able to sort of pierce the veil that can surround that oracular power. We should be able to try to see past different biases or incentives to propagate certain forms of ideology over others. And I think what the epistocrats are doing are using oracular expertise in a much less cynical way. They're using it in a literal way to almost describe the idea that there can be groups of people who are able to get past people's inherent subjective tendency to see the truth in socially situated ways. So how does oracular power happen? Well, we know ourselves from ignorance studies in the past, different analytical case studies, the ways that this oracular power can function, okay? So what I tried to do on this slide is just to describe a small instance of the oracular power of the World Bank. And that can be through using, in essence, language that veils more explicitly self-serving governance mechanisms. So for example, the World Bank has for about 20 years had so-called doing business reports, okay, where they try to estimate or gauge the investment-friendly nature of a developing country's investment landscape. And one of the indices that they rely on used to be called the Hiring and Firing Workers Index, okay? And this index essentially was matched with the least labor protections you had if you had fewer laws preventing quick dismissals, if you had minimum wage guarantees, if you had recourse to political help for workers who were dismissed, you were rated lower on the World Bank's scale, okay? So the easier it was for any developing country to fire workers, the higher investment ranking they would achieve, okay? And this led to a backlash from human rights activists and lawyers who suggested that this breaches people's right to dignified work, okay? People's right to have labor protections. They changed the terminology later when faced with this backlash to a more sort of anodyne way to describe the index, which is the employing workers indicator, okay? And this is not a new tactic. We know that language tricks can veil underlying political processes, but I think the function of ignorant studies scholars is to try to revive a discussion of the ways that these sort of ceremonial forms of activities, so that the ceremony of changing a more explicitly loaded vernacular to a more anodyne ones can have important oracular effects, making it easier for someone like Harvard to miss the ideological leanings of the World Bank. Okay, I hope that's slightly clear, and I'll come to an ending now. And I think there's many examples in the ignorant studies literature where this can happen. My colleague and friend Matthias Gross has talked about a very interesting and enlightening paper that talked about the making of gospels in Christianity, where the contribution of female authorship over seemingly apocryphal gospel texts which had never been necessarily legitimated by the church because they were discounted by earlier generations of male scholars who elevated the canonical gospels of, say, Matthew or Luke or John to a higher status, had the effect of making it seem as if female leaders in the church were less influential than they actually are, okay? So that would be, I argue, a form of oracular power that those church leaders had in the past. Another important example, and I'll come to an ending, I promise, is, for example, we know that probably one of the reasons for the invasion of Iraq was for the opportunity to exploit oil reserves. And even someone as conservatively sort of unimpeachable as Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, it pointed out in his memoir, he said, I find it disappointing that we don't admit that the Iraq war was partly about oil. Okay, so you've got Greenspan admitting this, but also recently the Chilcot inquiry was a long inquiry in the United Kingdom in order to investigate whether Tony Blair lied about the existence of so-called weapons of mass destruction that led up to the invasion. And as Dave White and Greg Mutit point out, the Chilcot inquiry, although it did shed some important light on the question of lies by Mr. Blair, it never looked at whether oil was a reason for the invasion. So this, in a way, is a ceremonial form of government inquiry that legitimates certain forms of propaganda as more problematic than others. So my last point, I haven't mentioned at all what I promised on the poster would be the great enlargement of knowledge, and that was to talk about the fact that we can see some of the populist backlash for the worrying threat to current forms of governance that they are, but not all forms of populism are equally illegitimate. There has been as well more realization that different forms of inequality, for example, are not necessarily natural, but could be linked to powerful ideologies displacing countervailing theories, okay? And I think that this enlargement of knowledge, which can be positive in many ways, is leading to another sort of double movement, which is a backlash against the enlargement, which is stemming from epistocrats who are essentially trying to contest quite legitimate claims for more forms of wealth distribution. And so in the past, we've known that knowledge can be tacitly linked to the maintenance of power. What we are seeing today is really the emergence of a new politics of explicit discrimination through knowledge in a way that amplifies people like Michel Foucault's earlier criticisms of the tacit ways that different forms of boundary making and normalization can be linked to the maintenance of different forms of social stratification. What was once more a tacit practice is becoming more explicit. Thank you very much.